Okay, today is Experiencer Day, Abductee Day, Contactee Day, whatever word you'd like to use to identify this particular phenomenon. As I think most of you out there are aware, there's a lot of different kinds of information coming forward about this phenomenon. Is it good? Is it bad? Is it neutral? Well, we're going to try to get to the bottom of these questions today. And to do it, we have 5 very distinguished researchers into the phenomena with us. Giles Hamilton, Dr. Richard Boylan, Dr. Edie Fiore, Dr. Karla Turner, and Dr. Jim Harder. So I'm going to start now with the first researcher to my left, Giles Hamilton. Giles?
Way back 16 years ago, there was a lady by the name of Lydia Stallmaker. I turned on the TV one afternoon, Channel 4 News out of Jacksonville. It showed Lydia Stallmaker out in the woods on the edge of Jacksonville with all the Channel 4 News staff, where showing them, talking to them, where she was picked up by a flying saucer. This was something quite extraordinary for 16 years ago. This fascinated me. Why? I hadn't been reading on flying saucers and UFOs and whatever. I actually hadn't had any great interest, but what she was saying on TV, the newsman, in detail, the whole 6 o'clock news was promoted to this. One thing led to another, without making a long story out of it. I found a friend of hers, had a phone number. I called her, and after her UFO experiences, Dr. Harder worked with her just prior to me starting to work with her. And she related all these experiences, and I started hypnotizing her after Dr. Harder, and I think this phenomenon existed with her, possibly with Dr. Harder. I haven't talked to him about it. I haven't seen him in 15 years. But this alien being verbalized through her, channeled through her, communicated through her. In fact, she is, I believe, the 2nd chapter in this book. This alien being told me if I would cooperate with them, they would send me all of their, or maybe not all, but some of their contacts. I had problems accepting this, and I didn't know anyone to talk to about it. I called Dr. Harder. I don't know if he remembers this or not. This was approximately 16 years ago. Right shortly, I had a nice little letter from him saying what I encountered was reality, and not let it bother me all that much. So, her statement that they would send me their contacts if I would cooperate with them. I told him I would. It wasn't but 2 days later it started. There was this lady that come to me. I was carrying on as a regular professional hypnotist, doing stress control, weight loss, smoking, and on and on and on. Basically under doctor referral. I was a medical hypnotist. And this lady come to me for me to help her with her nurse's exam, with her retention, recall, and so forth. And I worked with her. She started to leave, and she seen something that said UFOs on it. I got out on the porch, and she says, "Giles, are you interested in UFOs?" I said, "Why, Mary?" She said, "Well, I seen something in there. Why do you ask this?" There's something I wanted to ask you, and I was afraid you would think I was crazy. I said, "Mary, after what I encountered the other night, which was this situation with Stallmaker, I think nothing's crazy anymore." I says, what is it? She said, well, just prior to coming out here,
It's the same thing here, too.
I had a voice to come out of my head and says, go on, I got to come out. I stood there in the doorway with a cold chill running from my head to the bottom of my feet. Because I knew what this was. And I said to myself, oh my God, here it is. I pointed back into my easy chair that's where I had just hypnotized her at, and I said, young lady, get back in this chair and let's find out what's going on. She went back, got in the chair, and put her back under hypnosis. One thing led to another, and she started visualizing this alien being and said that he had a ring, a huge ring on his left hand, and she could feel a lot of energy emanating from this ring. She says, really, it's more than a ring. It covers almost his whole hand. It's exceptionally large, and I feel this energy from it. We went on with her visualization. She kept focusing in and describing it. I don't remember the complete details now. This was some 16 years ago. Tapes in this pile of tapes, I got it home. But my abductions, my experiences, I got probably 400 hours now on cassette tape, possibly 100, 150 hours on video working with these people. And anyway, we went on. After this visualization of the ring, we started passing telepathic communication with this alien being. Thank you. Well, he bring this to a close. As soon as she left, I went back in there to replay this tape. Where we felt this energy at was about middle ways of the tape. And when I replayed that tape after she left, where we started feeling this energy coming from this ring, after that, the last tape of this tape was wiped clean. The first tape of it's perfectly audible, it become a static on the tape, and it floated out and in. About the third time, then it was wiped clean, and it's 16 years old. Last time I checked it, it's that way today, and thank you very much. I've been slightly nudged here that I've used up my time, and thank you.
Thank you, John. Dr. Richard Boylan.
Good morning, students of the UFO ET phenomenon, researchers and experiencers out there. I'm Dr. Richard Boylan from Sacramento, California. I'm a clinical psychologist and researcher. Let me start with the chronology of my involvement in the UFO ET phenomenon and then begin to talk a little bit about the current path my work is taking. My interest in UFOs goes way back to when I was maybe this high, if you start with the table. 1947, when, believe it or not, I was a very young boy. That's the famous year Ken Arnold's sighting of a squadron of UFOs over Mount Rainier kind of marked the beginning of the public press awareness of the UFO phenomenon. And over the years following, including the famous 1952 flap of UFO squadrons over the U.S. Capitol, night after night, they couldn't cover up. I watched the debate between UFO researchers, amateur civilians, like many of you, reporting what they saw with their own true eyes versus the Air Force press information officers saying it wasn't that, swamp gas, flight of geese, and all that. And even as a young lad, was convinced that the UFO researchers had the better of the argument. Arguably, as UFOs are, they made a lot more sense than the so-called scientific explanations why they weren't what they were. So I stayed with that for my life while I got on with my career and family. In 1977, I saw a UFO personally in the hills of Marin County above San Francisco, and that moved from an interesting phenomenon to a personal experience. My father was from Missouri, and I was sitting down there, I'm from Missouri and I got to be shown. Well, I was shown, so that took care of the data problem for me. No. Then things kind of leveled off at that level for a while. And then I watched the phenomenon move from UFO hardware to extraterrestrial contact. And at first I didn't know what to make of that. I thought some of the early contact stuff didn't sound too well rounded, and some possibly so. So I kind of held back. And then I saw some professional folks get into the field and take a chance. Dr. Leo Strinkle of Laramie, Wyoming, counseling psychologist and professor, started publishing his works. I figured, well, there must be something here. Then in 1989, and I'm in private practice doing counseling all day long for a living. I took a couple of days off to be here. People started popping up in my caseload who came in for entirely different reasons, the usual family crisis or depression or whatever. And as we dug back into the earlier part of their life, in a few cases we ran across extraterrestrial encounter, sometimes fairly buried and sometimes remembered but shamefully hushed up. Many people are afraid when they were to tell a story to a psychologist or psychiatrist, they'd be fitted for a heavily starched white shirt pretty quickly. I didn't quite know what to do with it there, and then in '89, I believe it was, Dr. Edith Fiore's book Encounters came out, which she reported her work working with people of the experience in the South Bay area, and I was inspired by that to take a shot at it. Beginning in January of this year, I put out formal announcements to increase the number of cases I ran across over just what chance would bring in my caseload, and I'm up to 67 cases thoroughly investigated now. So I have some findings to share with you. We're not nearly going to get the time to do the subject justice today, but I do have my findings in a publication that's available out there in the back. Suffice to say that, 30 seconds. No. The phenomenon is real. We'll talk a little bit about what I think I found. I take some particular pleasure in, I think, doing some, I believe, original research about the difference between people who have a mild experience and people who are heavily traumatized and what's really behind that, which I hope to share with you later. So, look forward to a very interesting morning.
Thank you, Dr. Sloan. Dr. E. Fiore.
I'd like to thank you, Bob, for inviting me here. I really consider it a privilege, and it's been a pleasure, and I want to thank you all for being here in the audience. I never know what's going to happen when I come to a UFO symposium. In the last one, I met my soulmate, and we're engaged to be married, Richard Andrews, and that was in May. So that's By the way, he's in England. I mean, he lives in England. Actually, he's living with me now, but he was from England, so you see how the fates brought us together. So you're quite sure what's going to happen next. Back in 1950, a dear friend of the family, a playwright, and actually a screenwriter who wrote the beautiful movie, The Red Shoes, handed me the book, Flying Saucers Are Real by retired Colonel Major Donald Keogh. Hopefully you've read it. And I'd never even heard of flying saucers, and I gobbled up that book, and I was a complete and total believer. There was absolutely not the slightest doubt or shred of hesitancy in my mind. And I've never deviated from that position, even though I have some doubts about some other fringe areas, but there's just never been the slightest doubt in my mind. And later, in working with James Harder, I found out why there wasn't a doubt in my mind. But at any rate, that was long before I had started my formal training to become a psychologist. And I am a clinical psychologist, also in private practice in Saratoga, California, just south of San Francisco. And I began using hypnosis in 1973 and was using regressive hypnosis by 1974. And since then, which is almost not quite 20 years, I would say I should have kept a tally, and I can't, but it's too late now. But I would estimate that I've worked with about 400 people, patients who didn't come for that particular reason, but came with various complaints. And in getting to the source of the problem, we uncovered the fact that they had had CE4s, close encounters of the fourth kind, which are abductions by extraterrestrials or contacts or experiences, whatever you want to call them, but in other words, some personal contact with them. It has been extremely illuminating for me. I never doubted that there were UFOs and obviously very intelligent and advanced beings, advanced in terms of technology, manning these craft. I also heard about these early abduction experiences. I had some doubts about the validity of those. But in working with people in my office and finding that they come in with a phobia or whatever, and then they remember this experience, and then at that very moment the problem is resolved, I know that something very significant has happened in the office and of course happened to create the problem in the beginning. So my doubts about that are largely dispelled. Of course, you know, the subconscious mind is very, very creative, but I think that I call it clinical validity has been established. So I'd like to just pass the mic now and introduce that one to Karla. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Karla Turner.
Good morning, and thank you also for having us here. I wish I had someone like Edith to go to when my husband and I were having stress symptoms that took physical tolls on both of us back in early 1988. But we went to counseling to figure out why we were having such stress symptoms, and it was through relaxation hypnosis that eventually my husband suddenly began remembering some UFO encounters. We didn't know what to do with these, and like the rest of you, we were not interested in the subject. My background is in English. I have a PhD in Anglo-Saxon studies. I was a college instructor for many years. My husband was in computers. This simply was not part of our world, so we were babies about what was going on with our phenomenon. We knew nothing. We were lucky to make contact with an excellent abduction investigator named Barbara Bartlett, who works in Tulsa, Oklahoma. We met her in the summer of 1988, and like you said, the symptoms do soon disappear. I know after perhaps 3 sessions of hypnotic regression, my husband's very severe symptoms totally disappeared, and after 1 session, my TMJ disappeared, putting off surgery permanently. Anyway, we began working with Barbara to figure out what was going on with us. And Barbara's background, I think, is as important as mine since we worked together in the research field. Barbara began in the mid-70s as an assistant to Dr. Jacques Vallée when he was looking into cattle mutilation cases in the Oklahoma, Arkansas, Missouri, Kansas general area of the country. Barbara did the field work, and then when cases would merit further investigation, Vallée would come in and do that. As they were going through these mutilation investigations, abduction reports began to turn up. And Jacques was not as interested in these as Barbara was. And when they parted research company, if you will, in the early 80s, Barbara pursued the abduction reports. This was very fascinating and very important to her. She was the only person in the Tulsa area in 1987 who was doing this work when there was a literal invasion of this area. And I think there was similar invasion reports from different parts of the country where the cases literally exploded. Massive sightings, sheriff's reports, videotape from the television crews, hundreds of people seeing these and reporting these, and concurrently many, many abduction cases at this time. She located one of the best hypnotherapists in Tulsa and began working on a voluntary basis with some of these cases. And when the caseload simply got too large for him to do on his own, he trained Barbara personally with his regression techniques and turned it over to her. He supervised for a while and then was convinced she was competent, more than competent, to go on with the work herself. When we began working with her in 1988, Barbara had already investigated over 200 cases in this 4-state area. She had a wide background in the varieties of reports of the phenomenon. Since then, and once we worked through our material, I became her assistant, and I work on the other end of it. I very rarely do any hypnotic expression, although I've been trained by her and by another hypnotherapist in the Little Rock area. In an emergency situation, I can do it, although I do not choose very often to do so. My field of expertise is writing about these reports, assessing the material that comes out of the cases, making the initial investigations and interviews with the cases when they first turn up. And since working with Barbara, our cases have now come close to about 500. So we have a very wide background upon which to draw our data to make our assessment of patterns and conclusions and the questions that really need to be dealt with. Currently, I also have organized and head up an infection support group in the Central Arkansas area, and this has proven very beneficial to the people there. Oh, well, thank you. After lunch on the experiencers panel, I will talk about my book because this deals with the experiences that Barbara helped my husband and myself to uncover in our own cases, and this, of course, led us into the research. So I will talk about this a little bit later.
And the title is?
Into the Fringe. There.
Dr. James Harder.
Thank you, Bob. People ask me why I got interested in UFOs, and I must say it goes back to 1956 when I read Roosevelt's book on the report on UFO unidentified flying objects, he called it at that time. And, well, have you ever had any sightings? Well, I've seen strange things, but nothing stranger than people have told me about, but nothing that I would really say was a UFO. Except once Betty Hill and I were cruising around New Hampshire, and she was all excited about some lights in the sky over the lake. And she was so excited and convinced that I had to be sort of skeptical in response. But I must say, in response to later thinking that these colored lights that didn't move, didn't make any noise, and hovered no more than 1,000 feet over the lake, no more than 2,000 feet from us, was rather strange. But Roosevelт just gave the date after he retired from the Air Force. About his 2 years, and he didn't say anything more than just the facts. He didn't come to any conclusions. But I'm a very logical person. At least I like to think so. And that was just sufficient evidence that I thought any reasonable person in the world would be convinced in an instant. Unfortunately, or fortunately not. So I became a part of the APRO organization, fairly soon became the research director, and when the case came up in Northern California, one of our members, Leslie LeCrone, noted hypnotist and author, helped in one of our cases. I think that was the first hypnotic regression of a UFO abduction. That was in the early 60s, perhaps even earlier than that, except for the work that was done in Betty Hill in 1961. And so I've been at it more or less ever since, and I've been most recently interested not whether they're true or not. I was convinced of that 25 years ago. But what it doesn't mean, and why are people responding the way they are responding? Particularly, why is there such a negative spin put on it by certain people and in certain books? And who is behind this, and whether it's something that's based in reality, or is it based on some kind of misinformation and perhaps a sample of bias? I tend to think it's more that people who are inclined to find bad news will find it. And if they write books about bad news, and they invite people to write in and tell them about their bad news, they're collecting enormous amount of data. With hundreds, perhaps even 1 million people who've had some kind of close encounter in the United States alone, of which probably 95% are not remembered either. They have enormous data. You can select out of that anything you want to, sort of like a biblical scholar who wants to prove a point. You can find scripture will support almost anything you want to say. So Rich Boylan and Edie and several of us are trying to see if we can find a broader picture a statistically significant picture of what can come to a new life. And I find at least, that only about 1 person in 20 has a bad feeling about what happened to them. In one particular case, I don't know whether we have the slides up, and they're not particularly, we don't have enough, I'll do that later. Don't worry about the slides right now. But of 105 cases that we went through, more or less because these were people who came more or less at random and had in common only their music results. About 1/4 had reported a real physical encounter. 29 people. Of the 29, only 1 person reported bad feelings about it. 9 reported, or 10 reported they were scared, certainly at first, but they got over that. So my interest, and what I would want to say is, what does it mean and what is its significance for the future of the earth? I think that's the most important thing we need to address at this moment. Thank you.
Okay, now we will come around for the research and conclusions findings. Josh?
Yes, I would like to address this to Dr. Hart. I'm so glad he came out with what he said. 1 out of 10 having a bad consultation about this. And I thought it was such a wonderful thing. In one of the videotapes, I believe it was the lady astronaut from Russia, I believe it was here last year, I'm not sure, but she made a statement on this videotape, and it was so encouraged the way I feel, said that in Russia, as I understood it, they did not have a word for abductions, meaning as far as UFOs concerned. To them in Russia, it was just a beautiful spiritual joyride in space. This done me a tremendous amount of good because so much of the time that's the way I find it. And with these abductions, which I don't like that term, but seemingly we stuck with it, like Dr. Hart said there, it's by the negative consultation that the person puts on it themselves through fear. I've done a regression the other day with a young lady. I more or less sweated blood with her for 45 minutes because she was scared slapped to death. They picked her up at 6 years old and put her through all of this, and she was hyperventilating and on and on and on, but this was her negative attitude towards it because she was just frightful. And if they wouldn't look at it from a frightful way, and do you feel this way about this generally, Dr. Harder?
Well, I find that people have an initial fear reaction, which they get over, and I think Rich Borland's discovered that also. But usually during what I find is that during the hypnosis, if you ask the person fairly early on, are you receiving any messages? Are they saying anything to you? They will generally say, oh yes, they're telling me not to be afraid. And that helps them to remember that that was what they were told.
Thank you. I understood that, according to our friend here, I had another 20 minutes to talk about this, and this kind of leaves me at all. I'm not prepared for this morning because I don't want to double track on a lot of stuff, because myself and Ricky here, we having a 2-hour demonstration and a talk right on the stage here tomorrow afternoon, or tomorrow morning, 11 o'clock, I believe. It'll be about an hour talk, possibly 30 minutes demonstration, and question and answers, to where we go to attempt to channel an alien being through Ricky right here in the morning at sometime around 11:30, and this has been more of my research than working with the abduction, so to speak. It starts out with an abduction, what I do so much of the time, but then it goes beyond this, and all of these abductions we all hear so much about, the Greys, I've only really encountered the Greys to any large extent the last year. The first 13 or 14 years of my work, I was contacting, the ones I was contacting was out of this solar system, out of this galaxy. I want to look at it that they was more advanced than the Greys, possibly. They didn't have to go to this extent to go through all these abductions. The ones that my people was in telepathic communication with, as I said, was from beyond this galaxy. They seemed so much farther advanced. If they wanted to find out something about any one of us, they didn't have to go through this abduction. They would just hone in their computer on and get any kind of reading they wanted. Anything pertaining from their past lives on. To any of their background, getting any information whatsoever they wanted on them without, they didn't have to go through this abduction. And one thing I found out, there was nothing negative about these people. Very scientifically, they didn't have emotions, good or bad. They had progressed beyond emotions, and again, good and bad.
I'm going to speak about the overall findings I found in my research. With 67 subjects done in a very scientific study model way. So I feel both strong about what I'm going to share with you, and I think it will stand up to scientific criticism. You may or may not know that there was a conference on the close encounter experience at Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, in June. It was very covered up, not allowed to be reported widely in the press, and the proceedings still have not seen the light of day. I'm going to share with you what I shared there, plus more research. But you had over 150 of some of the best minds in the country, professors, Jim Harder, for example, clinical researchers, myself, and a number of others, and investigators from other disciplines. What's going to come out when those proceedings hit the press is we're going to have a conundrum in this country. Either we've got 150 of the best minds in the country that are clinically crazy, or else the UFO and extraterrestrial contact phenomenon is out of the closet and certified by one of the hardest science institutions of higher learning with one of the best reputations in the country. I think the latter is obviously a fact. As to individual cases, 3 of the persons with the extraterrestrial encounter experience are here today that I've worked with, and I will let them speak for themselves rather than speak for them. And I think when you get acquainted with them and what they have to say, you'll draw your own conclusions about the kind of work I do, to the extent that I made any difference in the way they process their experience. I also want to establish my credentials a little beyond the scientific, although I have no particular feeling of a need to apologize there. I am an experiencer myself. That happened after I had already started my research and been 3 or 4 months into it, when in April I had a close encounter. I don't want to get into that now, that's for another time. The last time I've had a close encounter with an extraterrestrial, not in face, but with a UFO, was last night near Area 51. And if I had rolled down the window and reached my arm out the door and driven a little close to the center line, I would have been able to touch it. And they played tag and safety escort with us while we were dealing with a very dangerous crowd near 51. And they even showed us how they do cloaking as cars and then uncloaking again. That may be a topic for later on. But to the research. One of the things I'm going to really put out here is that the definition of a close encounter, the fourth kind that I use, is someone who at least for one of their experiences had a three-dimensional being, physical body of extraterrestrial source show up close enough to them that they could reach out and touch the person or vice versa. Okay, that's my definition of a CE4. Now, I'm not putting down subsequent telepathic contact. I know for certainty that occurs where the extraterrestrial does not bother to show up in person, but maybe, I don't know what the range of telepathy is, but is reasonably close enough to do telepathic communication. That demonstrably exists and is often the method of choice of the higher evolved extraterrestrial races. They sort of get your attention by a personal visit, and then after that you learn to pay attention. I'm not putting down people who only claim telepathic contact with no physical show-up, but for scientific purposes, so I can deal with some of the hard-nosed folks who want to be able to hit with a hammer and listen to a ring. That's the definition I use. So when you hear about 67 cases, they're that rigorous that I'm talking about. I'm also going to share with you a very major debate that went on at MIT, where I was on one side with Jim Harder, I believe, we would agree, and several other researchers, and Bud Hopkins and David Jacobs on the other, and a few folks in that camp. And to kind of make it oversimplified, let's just say it breaks down into this. The negative spin crowd, the ETs are lurking, menacing, violative rapists, low-lifers, that if you could see them coming and get the drop on them first, you'd be justified in blowing them away. The other approach is to see extraterrestrials as initially scary, perplexing, confusing, and after a person is properly worked with, and I'll talk about that in a moment, a person generally, in my research experience, comes to see the contact as, on the whole, having more good points than scary or disquieting elements, and the net result is the person has felt they've had an uptick in their level of consciousness. I would submit from both the collective messages I've got from experiencers and from other sources, from other researchers around the country and the world, that the whole point of the general avalanche of contacts, both UFO sightings and close-up encounters, that has been peaking, particularly in this last year and will continue to peak into next year, is about a raising of consciousness. Some of this is on a individual level with a person by mind or, in some cases, physical manipulations that apparently have the result of raising a person's consciousness, attuning to telepathy, increased or the beginning of having of psychic gifts, etc., and a broader sense of our citizenship in a galactic community rather than I live in this country, you live in that country, and we don't think beyond the boundaries of planet Earth. So there's the severe trauma school that God, isn't it awful, and the expanded consciousness school of thought about what close encounters are all about. I have found, contrary to what I initially thought, because some of my initial thinking was influenced by some of the stuff in print that I found since to be unlikely to be true, that most people do not experience post-traumatic stress disorder level trauma from a close encounter. They may be scared as hell, but most people do not. And the people who do, I believe I found 3 reasons why they do. I want to share those with you. The 3 reasons are, with the people I've worked with, almost invariably, 1, they've had childhood sexual abuse, in some cases not remembered. And because of the nature of the way some of the extraterrestrial races do their medical scientific procedures, it flashes the person back to the childhood abuse. consider some of the parallels. There's the gynecological or urological medical exam involving, in some cases, probing or touching of the genital area. There are involuntary restraints against leaving in some cases. Some of the ETs get too close in your face. There are controlling behaviors by some of the less evolved ones. And then there's the repression of memory, either because of the shockingness of the initial experience or because the extraterrestrials induce a post-hypnotic suggestion that you won't remember the encounter, at least not until a later and better time. The other two reasons why some people seem to have an extraordinarily traumatic response are that they do not get the proper kind of debriefing and follow-up by the investigator. In some cases, the investigator has a bias or is leading in the way he or she does their hypnosis, the way they do their questions. The investigator already believes that, for example, all extraterrestrials are 3.5-foot grays who have no emotions and are very brusque and uncommunicative with the way they communicate. Or they lead in the questioning when a person is highly suggestible under hypnosis in ways that will cause the person to overfocus or exaggerate the parts of the experience that could become traumatic. The third reason is I have some very preliminary but compelling evidence, and others apparently are finding the same, that some of the traumatized persons are subjects of psychological warfare, staged pseudo-abductions with military or intelligence figures and aliens, or perhaps short humans in alien suits, conducting a pseudo-abduction experience using elements of hypnosis, drugs, electroshock, torture, or terrorizing techniques. And as a result of that, these persons are traumatized, believe they've had an extraterrestrial classic experience, and are therefore harnessed to put out the word that these people are awful, and become exhibits A through Z for the dark side analysis of what extraterrestrial contact is all about. When you take the people who've had varied childhood sexual abuse, the people who've been misguided and mishypnotized and led by a biased researcher, and the psych warfare subjects out of the crowd, I have not found anybody with post-traumatic stress disorder who's been properly counseled with follow-through. Let me share some other research with you. Sex of people showing up saying, I've had a close encounter, can you help me get a handle on this? Women, 54%, men, 45%. The age of people showing up, 38. These are not all young people. The youngest I've talked to is a 3-year-old, and the oldest I've talked to is a 61-year-old. I do not mean to suggest that there's not 80 and 90-year-olds walking around. I have anecdotal evidence from the 61-year-old that her grandmother probably had contact. This is not a 1947 phenomenon. How much do people recall a close encounter before they've had therapy and hypnosis? In my research, 9% have complete recall, 72% have partial, and 7% have no recall. It just comes out while something else is being looked at. Most people have enough of a hunch, a guess, or a partial memory fragment as they come in, of course. What's the degree of psychological reaction after a person's had a close encounter the 4th time? I find 23% have no symptoms. As a matter of fact, it was a cosmic meeting, interesting, a little shaky perhaps, but just transitorily so, and they're fine. People who've had what I call close encounter, extraterrestrial encounter syndrome, and I'll define that in a moment, I find 36% have that, a kind of mild level crisis that with proper handling and counseling soon settles down into a, well, that was bad, and moving on with life. And the traumatic folks with enduring life-disabling trauma, 27%. What's the mental sanity or insanity of people showing up saying, I've had a close encounter? Well, all I can tell you is my research population. Absolutely symptom-free, 66%. People with mild symptoms, they're not crazy, but they may have a little anxiety, they may be depressed, their marriage may be kind of shaky, 23%. People with severe mental disorders, 11%. In other words, 1 in 9. But that still leaves 89%, or 8 out of 9, psychologically sound. So we're not dealing with a bunch of Looney Tunes here. We're dealing with a very normal, representative cross-section of the population. And 5 other research studies at MIT came up with the same conclusion. What's the people's attitude towards their close encounter after they've had some counseling? Positive, 61%, ambivalent, saw a lot of good things, but some negative things, it was scary, or I'm puzzled, or I feel unfinished. 36%, negative, 2%. Let me talk a little bit about the vast majority of people's reaction to a close encounter from a psychological point of view. That's my specialty. And I want to pick what I've spent a little time on in defining a close encounter syndrome. Kind of mild level of psychological crisis that with proper handling soon settles down. See if any of this fits anybody you know who's had a close encounter. I would say if they've had 3 of the or more of the following 13 symptoms, they probably had a real close encounter. Repeated anxiety or unexplained restlessness. A fearful reaction to pictures or other cues that might remind a person of a close encounter. Classic one is, I didn't like that face on the cover of Communion. Chronic sleep disturbance or nightmares. Obsessional dreams or daytime thinking about UFOs or extraterrestrials or close encounters. Compulsive behavior concerning UFOs, like reading about them all the time. Unexplained moodiness or irritability after what might have been a CE4 situation. Body symptoms or signs of close encounter, scoop marks, laser, straight line cuts, etc. Feelings of social unordinariness, feeling like you suddenly jumped out from the pack of humanity and are in a special category. Intrusive cosmic awareness. People who used to worry about the stock exchange telling, well, now I'm kind of thinking about, gee, there are probably people out there in the whole planet, I got to get a bigger perspective. Sense of receiving telepathic messages or repeated gifted intuitions. Person wakes up one morning and suddenly is interested in physics or figured out the answer to some puzzling scientific thing. Sense of episodic shared mind space with one or more extraterrestrial beings. I'm not talking about the crazies who hear voices. I'm talking about somebody who's normal, but once in a while gets this kind of hunchy, messagey sense inside their head, or sometimes even clearer than that. 12, psychic or ESP ability, either getting it when you didn't have it or if you had some, a whole lot more. And lastly, an obsessive sense of having a mission derived from the close encounter. And that sense of mission may be clear, it may be vague, or it may be unconscious, but you're kind of restless. There's something I should be doing. And often with hypnosis and counseling, a person comes to clearly relive and re-experience and hear what the extraterrestrials had to say to them and get their particular mission. And people have different missions. I'd like to say a little bit about how I do therapy. Everybody's got their own style. This is what I think seems to do the job well from my experience. Prompt intervention. Don't wait 2 or 3 years, but people, I know, I've talked to them, been sitting on this for 30, 40 years, decades, waiting to find somebody who was going to lock them up if they talked. I put an announcement out in the paper, friendly, sympathetic psychologist wants to talk about your CE4 experiences. People have been pouring in the door. They've been waiting, in some cases, for decades. Reviewing the person's history with attention to remembered or possibly repressed CE4 episodes, listening with a tendency to accept the story rather than overcriticalness. If people are lying, bullshitting, or playing wannabe, that'll become obvious soon enough. I found you're better to err on the side of acceptance because we're still learning about the variety of races, the variety of styles, and the approaches. And it's too early to say, well, I haven't run across that so far, so you're probably lying. Okay, great. We're in good shape. Using hypnosis, and I think that should be done by someone who knows what they're doing, with no bias, and if the material that brings up is traumatic for the person, scary, creating emotional crisis, if the person who's doing the hypnosis themselves is not a professionally trained therapist, they should move the person over to a sympathetic therapist, sympathetic to this phenomenon, for working through the emotionality. I do not have an argument with people who are well trained and do good hypnosis and tag team with the therapist. Between the two of them, they get the job done where it needs that. And not everybody needs therapy. Some people just need grounding that they're not crazy and to find out about the government cover-up. And once they do that, they realize they're normal, they just had an extraordinary experience and they can go on. Obviously, integrating what you come up with what you already remember from conscious state, providing a little reassurance, and very much important, connecting with a support group of fellow genuine experiencers. Now, not to offend folks, but there are some so-called UFO or experiencer groups out there that are really kind of contactee wannabes, or maybe kind of new age enthusiasts who are long on imagination and short on experience. But when you get in a crowd, in a circle with some genuine experiencers, it is amazing what goes on in there in terms of not so much emotional support, but consciousness sharing. And what I like to say with the group I work with, it's like a jigsaw puzzle. Everybody comes in, brings a piece, and when everybody puts all this stuff on the table together, an amazing whole and very large picture emerges. Thank you very much. We'll talk more about this later.
Dr. E. Fiore.
I've noticed that sometimes when I've given this presentation or one that's related to it, that there are reactions that you in the audience might have. So I want to just discuss that before I begin. You may find yourself feeling kind of sick or upset. And the best thing to do is just hang in there and take note of that, because that will be another piece of this jigsaw puzzle that Rich was talking about. I gave a workshop in Denver, that fateful meeting, symposium, and one woman left the room after feeling dizzy, went actually up to her room and threw up. And then she came back down about half an hour later. It was a 2-hour workshop, and went back to her room and fainted. And I didn't know what was going on. I just saw her leaving. And then later she told me the next day, so anyway, I put her in the hands of somebody who could continue to work with her, namely Leo Sprinkle. So you may find that you're having some reactions. There was a recent survey, the Wilbur survey, that concluded that approximately 1 out of 50 people in the United States has had the abduction experience or CE4 experience, whatever we want to call it. That would be over 4 million people if they're right. And even if they're not right, let's say that half of those people have had experience. That's 2 million people. That's a lot of people. And what I find in my work is that most of these people have very little idea of this. In other words, people may come for help because of a phobia or whatever, and they uncover the CE4. They had no prior knowledge of it. But I'd like to do something that I often find missing in these presentations, and that is to give you a picture of the typical CE4 experience. I think that as a presenter, we often assume that you all know, but some of you, I know I talked to one man here who's here for the first time, so you may not be aware of what the typical CE4 is like. So I'd like to just, drawing upon composite cases, put one together for you. Let's call the abductee Anna. And And the typical one would begin at night. Let's say she's about 34 years old, married with 2 children, and she's living with her husband and children in suburban America. And she would awaken in the middle of the night, maybe early morning, to find 3 or 4 alien beings standing at the foot of her bed, and they would be about between 3.5 to 4 feet tall, with large, oversized heads, sort of wraparound eyes that look like they're wearing dark glasses, no visible nose, just 2 little holes, no visible ears, but from the side maybe holes, and a little slit for a mouth, a very thin neck, a small body in relationship to the head, kind of frail looking, but actually very strong, with very long arms and long fingers, and generally 3 or 4 fingers rather than a typical 5 fingers. They, by the way, would be hairless. And to begin with, waking up at night, even with somebody you wouldn't expect to be there, is a rather frightening experience. But can you imagine waking up and seeing somebody there, or something there that is beyond what you've ever seen before? That in itself is frightening. Now, I would like to say this, that the reason that this is traumatic, which is sort of silly to say because it's the reason anything is traumatic, is because of the person's reaction to the experience. But I think it would be, and even I would be, after all the work that I've done, if I woke up out of a sound sleep and saw any kind of strange person in my room, let alone strange beings, my momentary reaction would be fear. And that's why we have the reaction of fear. This is a normal reaction. We're given this as part of our defense system, so that Anna feels fear. And then she is sort of immobilized in a sense. She can't scream out, she cannot resist. This is the typical pattern. And she is compelled to go with them, or propelled, and maybe even taken physically, one on each side, taken outside to an awaiting craft, which could be a shuttle craft, and she's forced into this. Now, at this point, her fear is mounting to panic. She gets into this craft, and she's taken into a larger craft, a mothership. So she's lifted up and taken into this craft. She's escorted into this circular craft, goes down a circular corridor, and into a central room that's also circular. Now, in this room, there's a table, a metal examining table on a pedestal base. There is a well-lighted room, but the source of the light is not obvious. There are other beings who may not be paying much attention to her. We'll call them grays. These are beings who are 3.5 to 4 feet tall. Usually there is a taller person who kind of seems benevolent, who it may be 6 or 7 feet tall, who is different from the others, who appears always to be the one in charge. Anna is told to disrobe, and she's more or less under their control. At this point, it's hard to resist. I feel that they're using a form of telepathy, so hypnotic suggestions directly to her subconscious mind and conscious mind, but it's because it's telepathic, generally speaking, maybe even combined with the verbal. She is rather powerless to resist, and she's still extremely frightened at this point. She gets onto the table, and a thorough examination, physical examination is carried out. Now, she is there in her physical body. This is the typical CE4. First of all, every orifice of her body is inspected and looked into. So her eyes are looked into, her nose, her mouth is open, and either stomach fluids, the contents of her stomach are removed with a tube being put down into her stomach. And after that, or a greenish liquid is poured into her stomach, which seems to have a tranquilizing effect. Before this has happened, let me backtrack a bit. The taller being who's in charge usually stands standing in back of Anna with his hands on her temples and telling her to relax, and she would feel kind of goodness and love coming from him, and she would relax. So that from this point on, it's not quite as terrifying, but it still isn't fun. And it isn't like uplifting at this point at all. And the examination is carried out. Now, they will go down into the genital area, looking into that area, and of course she will feel embarrassed and humiliated because these are men and these are strangers, and this is being done against her will. and then they do a rectal examination. And at one point, they will put a needle into her navel and extract ova from her, whether she likes it or not. And if she protests, that's just too bad. And then, during this examination, an implant is put into her nose through the right nostril. There's a needle with a little, kind of teeny little crystal that's put into her brain. And, or that, this is, I'd rather give you all the variations, we're just going to do the typical one here. Now, this is important, and I think that this is, my viewpoint deviates somewhat from previous authors. Let's say that Anna has had a very severe yeast infection that has been incurable and very recurrent. A medical treatment is carried out, a healing treatment is carried out, in which some gel would be inserted into the vaginal area. And this would have a healing effect, a curing effect, so that not only has the exam been carried out, but there's been an effort to heal her for whatever problem she has. Let's say that's the only major problem or problem, minor or major, depending on how you look at it, that she has. Now at this point, she may ask them where they come from, and they may say the Pleiades, they may say Zeta Reticuli Sirius, or they may not give her answers at all. And then she is told to dress, and as she's dressing, she is told that she will absolutely not remember this experience. Now, if she is a very kind of frightened type of person in general, she'll be more than happy to agree mentally, yes, I do not want to remember this. If, on the other hand, she's feisty, let's say that she's feisty, she'll think, I want to remember this. And she may have some anger involved with that, or she may just feel that this is quite an extraordinary experience, but she decides to remember it, even though they've told her she's going to forget. Then they will return her to her room, and she'll go to sleep, and she'll wake up and not remember it. But she may have, from that point on, a phobia of not even being able to go into that room, or having to sleep with the light on. So that would be, and also feeling insecure, so that she is left with psychological problems. So that is the typical experience that I have seen in working with, say, 400 people. And this is a composite person. Now, this is just one of the series of CE4s. Because if Anna came to see me for help, we would start with that one because she would have a phobia, which would be bringing her into my office. But we would find that she had had these experiences ever since childhood. We have a defense mechanism. We have lots of defense mechanisms that we employ to keep us stable. And one of them is called repression. And that is a type of forgetting that is not a childhood forgetting, but it's a squishing down and blocking out of our memory, creating an amnesia or partial amnesia for experiences. And because of that, these events are not remembered. But there are ways that we can figure out whether we've had the experience or not. And as a clinician, these are the things that I look for. And I have listed 10 of them, some of which Rich has already alluded to, but I'll go over my list. The first one is the missing time phenomenon, and that is where there is a period of time ranging from about 45 minutes up to, say, several days even, but usually it's about a few hours, in which the person absolutely cannot account for the time. Now, of course, this is not, we're not counting on being drunk or under the influence of drugs or anything of that sort, but there's sort of a blackout. And this can occur while a person is driving. All of a sudden, several hours have passed, they may even be on a long road, or it could be during the day. The problem with the missing time phenomenon is that a lot of these experiences occur at night. We're really generally not that aware of two or 3 hours that would be missing at night, particularly if they go right back to sleep. The second is nightmares or dreams, even one nightmare or one dream, but particularly repeated ones, of UFO or ETs. The third is sleep disorders. For instance, the sort of thing where you might wake up at 2:54 every morning, or have trouble going to sleep, or not being able to sleep at night at all. I had one student, college student, who couldn't go to sleep until it was dawn. Fourth is waking up with unusual bodily sensations. That's usually a tingling feeling or a paralysis or something of that sort, just feeling very, very different. And 5 are physical marks on the body. This, of course, is the consequence of the physical examination. Oh, I didn't mention that they would extract blood and put things of the nails and hair, and maybe scrapings of the skin. They would take little plugs of skin. So, of course, when this is done, it leaves a bruising, at least a scarring. 6 is feeling monitored, watched, and or communicated with. And, of course, we have to discount those people who are really mentally disturbed. 7 is the sighting of a UFO. This is usually the only, a bit of the memory of the CE4 that is allowed in the conscious memory. The rest is repressed. 8 are vague recollections of CE4s, of one or more CE4s. And this is where the repression is not complete, where there's sort of like a feeling of maybe it happened, maybe it was a dream, I can't be sure. 9 are unexplained healings. Because in 50% of my cases, I found that people have been healed, sometimes of life-threatening illnesses. So that if a person has migraine headaches, and then all of a sudden one day they wake up and they don't have a migraine headache any longer, this may be a sign. 10 is reacting with fear and or anxiety about UFOs and or ETs. And as Rich mentioned, the cover of communion has evoked a lot of responses from people. One of my patients actually urinated in the bookstore when she saw the cover of that book. Just lost complete bladder control. Because what she was doing is she was reliving with that loss of bladder control and with the emotions of fear what she actually had experienced before. You see, the repression could not be maintained because of the similarity. In this case, the face of the book compared to the memory of the face that she had seen before. I think we have to ask the question, are these CE4s real? Well, we have the evidence of worldwide reports that are similar. In other words, what I just told you with the hypothetical Anna, a researcher in France or Japan or South America would be telling you. 2 are these remembered under hypnosis CE4s are similar to the ones that are consciously remembered. And some of these people are not sophisticated. They haven't read the literature. So it isn't as though they read a book about this, for instance, like my book, and then they come in and report this. Now, of course, many have come in because of reading this book. I collected my data before my book came out, obviously. 3 are, there are multiple abductions with similar accounts. And maybe, I'm not sure of Karla's presentation, but often similar family members have been abducted, and under hypnosis or even outside of hypnosis, they report the same thing. Or it could be friends, kids on a beach somewhere who were picked up. 4, we have the marks on the body are similar to other abductees. In other words, the scrape marks, the puncture marks, the scoop marks, including nosebleeds, which of course are due to the implant. The reason that I feel that these are real is that the dreams that people have or the nightmares that they have, if the person is put under hypnosis, they turn into not nightmares or dreams at all. They're actually flashbacks to the experience. And most importantly to me as a clinical psychologist is the crippling symptoms that people have had that were eliminated by doing a regression to the CE4. In other words, as I mentioned when I was introducing myself, it just doesn't make sense for a symptom to be eliminated at that moment by somebody making up a fantasy. Let's say they've had a problem of a very, very severe phobia for years, Does it make any sense whatsoever, but this phobia may have crippled them, that with 20 minutes of hypnotic regression, that is a little fantasy that they're making up, and now they're totally free. There's not a twinge of anxiety when they drive by that place or go into the garage or wherever they had the problem. Now, I'd like to talk about the effects of these seeking course, and I'm going to skim through this because we are 2 minutes, okay? So I'm just going to read these to you, and of course, Rich did talk about some of them. First of all, the major psychological effect is fear. This can range from phobia to panic attacks, to mild fear to anxiety attacks, and these are ET, UFOs, being kidnapped, abductors, needles, medical equipment, monsters and owls because of the big eyes, and the dark. 2 are night terrors and nightmares. 3, insomnia. 4, sense of helplessness and powerlessness. 5, general insecurity. 6, sense of impending doom. And 7, fear of going insane, which is a terrible psychological effect. And I mean, I just can't imagine what that would feel like. On the plus side, we have the development of psychic abilities, which are healing abilities, seeing auras, being more intuitive, being able to read people, and developing precognition. Then we have the sense of a mission, which Rich alluded to, which is a world of consciousness, a desire for world peace, maybe a political activism, getting involved in ecology. Also, another effect of these, which I also alluded to earlier, are healings. In 50% of my cases, there were healings, sometimes permanent, sometimes not permanent. And these can range from mild problems to life-threatening problems. I mean, really life-threatening, like an AV formation in the brain. So I will stop at that. Well, one more thing I want to say. I'm not going to get into cases at this point. I may later, but I probably have a minute or so left. Everything depends on how the person reacts to the experience, whether it's traumatic or not. If the person could overcome their initial reaction of fear, this can be an extraordinary experience, because think what it means. You're interacting with intelligent beings from another galaxy, perhaps, or other worlds. And it could be one of the most significant peak experiences of a person's life. So it just depends on how the person reacts to it. 2 people could react completely differently. One could be traumatized, maybe insane. I mean, I haven't had that kind of situation, but it's conceivable. And, well, we saw that from the presentation from AJ, the person in Brazil, he expressed childhood. He was virtually no longer functioning. And the other could be that this person could become extremely powerful in the world in terms of bringing world peace, or using at least his own personal life, having a real beautiful meaning in his life as a result of the experience. The very same experience, so it's how we react to it that determines whether it's going to be a, quote, good experience or bad experience. I'd like to stop on that note. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Buer. Dr. Karla Turner.
I suppose if a person can learn to forgive and understand and sympathize with a rapist, it's not a bad experience. However, I don't think that that's necessarily good for the rapee nor for the rapist. All right, I'm going to give you some of my conclusions and some questions that I have about the research phenomenon and the research findings and reporting so far. Here are the conclusions that I've reached from the research with material from almost 500 cases personally with Barbara, and also with talking with cases from other researchers, not just the researchers reporting on those cases, but those cases themselves. I would say these things may be true. Aliens know our psychology and our physiology very well. They are not doing experiments to learn about us, they know about us. The nature and extent of their involvement in repeat abductees' lives is somehow actively exceeding the mere impact of the specific encounters. I can talk about that a little later. The aliens, whatever they are, and I use that term only as a shorthand notation. I have no idea if they're from another planet, another dimension, this dimension, whatever, but I will call them aliens just for convenience, are physical and limited beings. They are not spiritual beings. The aliens use technology that allows them to manipulate other dimensions, such as time and space, which is so impressive to us that we may think their abilities to do this are natural rather than technological, and therefore that they have some spiritual edge on us. Aliens' deceptive dealings with humans makes them unworthy of human trust. For instance, they use screen memories to disguise conscious events, encounters, onsets, events within those encounters, and the closing of these encounters, and a screen memory is in fact a false memory. Therefore, it is deceptive. They present themselves in false guises using this same sort of device. They do not show us what they actually are. They show us images that are not real. This is deceptive. They give us false experiences that seem very real to us. We can have an experience that feels, in every sense of the term, real as you and I sitting here this morning, which in any objective sense of reality do not have it. This is deceptive. Screen memories, such as the ones we've talked about and that you may have read about, not only extend to conscious events, but from the case work that we've been doing in the last couple of years, we have very good reason to believe that these screen memories can also penetrate to levels that even under hypnosis, once these are recovered, are still false memories and mask yet further, deeper events of a different reality. So I would say that I think it is imprudent to accept the actions of these beings at face value, and I think it is further foolish to accept their words as truth. So what do I think we can accept? What answers may we believe? If we look at the data openly, and looking at the available data that you can get in the bookstores now and at the conferences now and the presentations now, I think there are some questions about what we find presented to us. Now, abduction research, and I've done my homework and read everything I can available on it. I've talked with many other researchers, not only in the mental health profession, but outside of it, who have worked with these cases. Off the record, they have admitted that the reports they make public are censored. They are partial. They're in some ways not the entire picture. But Hopkins is proud of the fact, for instance, that he holds back certain pieces of information for his own purposes. That means that when you read these reports, you're not getting all the data. David Jacobs, for another, admits that in the material he used in Secret Lives, for instance, although he had a fairly limited number of cases, I think less than 80 to work with, he chose to throw out 17 of those cases before presenting the data because they didn't fit any pattern. Again, you're not getting an entire picture of this phenomenon. So therefore, you're getting censored, partial, and therefore misleading reports on what's going on. And yes, there are typical abduction experiences. But for many people, what is seen as the typical abduction experience doesn't even come close to covering the variety of bizarre encounter events that they go through. They read these typical reports and say, well then, what was it that happened with me? If this is what really goes on with the aliens, I must be crazy, or I must be in some way out of the loop, and why are these things happening that I'm never reading about or hearing about? There is, in the hundreds of cases, not only that we've dealt with, but that others have reported on privately, although perhaps not publicly, a definite sexual aspect to the encounters. Not just reproductive, but sexual. Oral sex with a 5-year-old is not reproductive, nor is it some sort of physical, scientific, observable examination. This is just one example, we have many. There are a wide variety of physical marks left on the bodies of abductees, and not just the scoop marks and the straight line cuts. It's very hard to find in the reported data these varieties of marks being made available. So you may have marks that don't fit what you've been told is typical or what is officially accepted. There are many triangular marks, sometimes circles, discolored skin making triangular circular areas, puncture marks that make triangular areas. There are claw marks in wide swaths. I brought a few of those with me if you're interested in looking later, that are not recorded in most of the data. There are many events that happen directly related to the abduction event that people go through that have nothing to do with reproduction or with the raising of consciousness or with physical examinations that involve such things as livestock and pets that we don't see any real logical reason for. Pets who are locked in one area, for instance, when an abduction occurs, are found in a different area with the lock still intact. Horses have been moved as far as 2 miles away out of a locked corral and into another person's corral at the time the owners of the horses were undergoing an abduction. We don't know what these things mean, but if they are part of the phenomenon, you don't get these reports when you're getting the partial reports presented to the public. If we don't understand the peripheral or the nonsensical data, then we don't get a clear theory. We can't get a theory that's going to be acceptable or believable. We have to account for every bit of the data. Physical and emotional pain is somehow harvested by these beings also. It may be a byproduct in some person's mind that they're doing an examination that's ultimately for our benefit, and it just happens to cause pain, but they somehow take this pain or harvest this pain physically and mentally from the person that they are abducting. And sometimes they even induce a fictional experience, something that's not happening in objective reality but seems real, in order to generate extreme fear or extreme anger. And then this seems to be, again, harvested. We don't know what they're doing with this energy. We have numerous reports of aliens who have already had an abduction relationship with a being at some point in this experience, removing the abductee's psyche or consciousness from the body, installing an alien entity into the body, and then sending that human body out, unbeknownst to those around this body, using this as a vehicle for some other purpose. And often the psyche or the consciousness of the person whose body has been borrowed is allowed to watch this from some ship or other facility to see that their body can be used by these beings to do things that the person has no control over. Sometimes aliens threaten and demean abductees. I remember in September at a closed abduction support group that John Carpenter and Bud Hopkins and Linda Howe and several others had at the Missouri conference after the conference was over. There were about 30 abductees there. And when it came time for one particular person to speak, she introduced herself and said she wanted to apologize in advance to us for what she was going to be forced to have to do, that the ETs had not asked for her cooperation. They had insisted she would cooperate, and if she didn't, it would cost her her 10-year-old child's life. This is not an isolated case. In our own research, we have cases exactly like this, where parents are threatened that they must do certain things told to them by the ETs that they would not want to do, or else they will lose their mate or they will lose their child. And aliens start very early on in these repeated abductions to indoctrinate us, if you will, to brainwash us into believing that we belong to them, that we are dependent upon them, that we are indebted or obligated to them. Something along the lines of the Stockholm Syndrome of hostage taking and of kidnapped victims. They tell children very early, we are your real parents, not those people there in the bedroom in the house we just took you from. We are your real parents. They say that we are, in some ways, their descendants. For instance, I know in 1980 when I had an encounter with 4 beings, they insisted to me that they were my ancestors. And so we are obligated, are tied to them early on, as deeply as they can persuade us to be. Raise at least this thought. I know that I'm a limited person. I have human logic and human morality, and I think this is really what God gave me to work with, and therefore don't blame me if that's what I do have to work with. But I have to ask some logical questions. First off, the things that Edith has described as going on in a typical abduction, and not to mention the much more bizarre abduction experiences that do happen. If these things were done to one human being by another, would we call this consciousness raising? Would we call this the most wonderful experience in a person's life? Or would we call this abduction, an infliction of unwanted physical intrusions on our bodies? Now, while we're able to hold people who do that to one another accountable by law, and yet to think it's wonderful when it happens by non-physical beings, logically escapes me. Secondly, there is such a thing known as the good cop, bad cop syndrome. When a person is trying to be broken down for either information or cooperation, the same force, the same group trying to gain this cooperation or information can take the two opposite approaches. At first, the person may be faced with someone who's very intimidating, very threatening. In other words, to bring them to that sort of frightened state of mind where they're in need of help, they're fearful and in need of help. And then the frightened or intimidating person is withdrawn, and the good cop comes in. That's all right, I'll be your friend, I'll take care of you, I'll make the pain go away, you can trust me, you can talk to me. And we're so much in fear and so much in need of help that we turn to this person and begin to develop a sense of trust. This works very well, human to human. And as I said at the beginning, aliens know our psychology very, very well. I think there's no reason to think they would not resort to such methods to gain our trust or our cooperation themselves. If you think of it, is it likely that a benevolent group or race down here for benevolent purposes would occasionally do bad things, harmful things, painful things to the people they're trying to help? Is it more likely that a group that is not benevolent, that has designs that may not be to our advantage, would sometimes do good things, healings, helping, spiritual statements or experiences to these people in order to either throw them off track or to gain their trust or to cover up an essentially sinister agenda? By human logic, the second seems more likely than the first. Now, we don't really have any answers. If anyone here or elsewhere tells you these are the answers, that person is lying. We have no verifiable answers. We have theories galore. We have assumptions. We have hopes. And we have fears, but we have no answers. There's no book to check these answers in. There is no verifiable source for anything that we may conclude at this point. There's a lot of divisiveness among the researchers. I think Richard talked about the two camps, and they sounded like, sworn enemies. I don't know how you're going to get any kind of answers if you've got camps in a standoff with each other. Your way is wrong and my way is right. No, your way is wrong and my way is right. This is not going to get us anywhere. At worst, it divides us and keeps us from putting the material together, and it may even indicate agendas on the part of some researchers that are not simply seeking answers, but are seeking something else. None of the theories that you're going to find out here today, none of the current theories account for all the reported data. They are partial. And everything about this phenomenon eludes scientific methods of proof and verification. So if we depend on a merely scientific approach, we're not going to get anywhere either. After years, literally years of research, as Bob pointed out, some of the best minds in the world, some of the best minds in various fields have been focused on this. We have no answers. No verifiable, documentable answers to even the most fundamental questions. We don't know the exact nature or origin of these beings. Now, somebody may tell you they do, but they can't prove it. Well, he told me, the ET told me he was from Zeta Reticuli. Well, that's not proof. The aliens sometimes seem to want us to love them, and other times they seem to want us to fear them, and we have no idea why. We don't know exactly what they're doing with our reproductive material and physical samples that they're taking from us, and they've given at least two implied and explicit explanations for this. One is, of course, the crossbreeding alien-human race that they're supposedly coming up with. They tell us that, and they show us that, but again, they can be deceptive in what they show us, so we can't take that as proof. They have also shown and told other abductees that the reproductive material they take from us, including the fetuses, as well as the sperm and ova, are used to make their biological robots, all those little grays you see running around, the ones that most of you encounter. According to some of the things that these ETs have told their abductees, those are not ETs. Those are robots, and they're made strictly from human material. The ETs are the ones in charge of them. So they're taking our fetuses and our babies, perhaps, and making the workers that they send out in the field to do most of the dirty work. Is this true or not? We don't have verification. We don't know the motivation behind the repeated alien predictions of a global change and chaos. And we don't know how far to trust them. They've made predictions in the past, none of which have come true. And yet they're making much more widespread predictions now. Again, how much faith and how much trust do we have to put into these? Is there another motivation for making these kinds of predictions? And again, I'd just like to say, with so many years of so much excellent research, why are we no closer to verifiable answers? Bob, how much more time do I have? 2 minutes. I don't have time to go into some sample cases that would show you the kinds of deception at work here, but I will say that very often people come away from the experience, even after hypnosis, and believe that they have had a benevolent encounter, that they've been given spiritual, uplifting information, and that they are special and chosen to have a job to do. With further probing beneath this recalled memory, very often extremely opposite experiences do emerge that involve anything but spiritually uplifting encounters. And so I would warn you that whatever you read, whatever you think, to be cautious of accepting any of it at face value. And I'll go into more of these experiences later. Thank you.
Dr. James Harder.
Now, following on what Dr. Turner has just told you, I hope she would be the first to tell you not to believe everything that individuals tell you in the analyses that she herself has made on the basis of her investigation. What I find is that people find the people that they want to find. And sometimes, as Giles Hamilton has said, they send people to him. Now, maybe there's a particular UFO group that are particularly fond of Giles. Maybe there's another ET group that's particularly fond of Dr. Boyle, and he gets them. Now, we know in the vicinity where Karla lives, there's a fairly indecent type of alien abroad who are doing calculations, and that may be heavily involved. And people who have that kind of experience, who remember it, come forward, and you get 500 cases of that. What is 500 out of 500,000? You see, we are in the position, and I would agree with Karla now, I'm kind of like the 5 blind men who were trying to describe an elephant after their tactile investigation. And to do things on the basis of examples, now that's a famous journalistic point of view, that you can prove things by examples. You can certainly illustrate things by examples. I could do that too. I had a telephone call recently from a woman who believed that various things had happened to her. And she wanted to get she wanted my help in getting this verified so she could appear on one of the television programs. It turned out that she believed that somebody had come down and taken her baby, her fetus, away from her. And she wanted this to be well known. Well, I said, were you pregnant? Well, of course. I said, had you had any sexual relations in the last year? Well, no. Did you see the fetus? No. Did they tell you they were taking fetus? No. But how did you know they were taking your fetus? Oh, I know it in my heart. Well, what can you say about a person who can be fantasy prone? 5% of the population are fantasy prone. And what percentage of the people who give their IT to be on the Giraldo show? Fairly large percentage, maybe 5%, maybe 2%. But that's a very large. We have millions of people out of which you can select whatever you want to select. Now, following Giles' point of view, he has not seen the grays until just recently, in his experience. It may be that the grays are a reflection of expectations on the part of the people who come to see the investigators. I've not seen very many grays myself. It may be that they're relatively inexperienced. Perhaps they're newcomers that are not technically advanced. It's taken them this long to get here. After all, they've had 40 years, and it's just now that they're arriving, right? Everybody else got here in 1950. The good guys got here in 1950 because they could go a lot faster. They're crafted a lot better. They're more highly evolved in many ways. Now, it's hard for people to realize how many different alien groups there are out there. There are 57 members of just the Federation. And that's just the good guys. There are about three who are renegades who just belong to the Federation, who've been kicked out for bad behavior of the sort that you've probably heard a little bit about. And then there are scores of others that haven't even made it into even being accepted or even considered for being acceptance into the Federation. And some of those are working out for Rich Boylan as risking his life gathering information. And people who are psychotherapists, they get a certain spin on this because people come to them who are in trouble. I have not any problem with the facts that some of these things do happen, but I do have a problem in thinking that they are typical. I've myself talked with at least 500 people over the last 30 years. And I get a very different picture from what Dr. Turner finds. I don't mind, for instance, if somebody tells you or gives you the impression that he's different from what he is. He looks like a blonde Nordic, okay? And then after I look at it, I ask the person a little more carefully to look at what it really was. And it wasn't blonde Nordic at all. Well, that's a bad feeling, you know, that gives you, they are in some way distorting reality. Well, okay, you go to a dentist. He doesn't use Novocaine. He pulls one of your molar teeth without Novocaine, without distorting reality. Now, is he a better dentist than the person who gives you Novocaine first, who distorts your reality relative to pain? I ask you. There are some sorts of things when if an alien person who looks very strange, perhaps like your mother-in-law, or in some other way threatening, distorts reality to the point where he appears to be less threatening than he would otherwise appear, but perhaps a lot more benevolent than you would believe. Now, most of these extraterrestrials come from civilizations that have been around for a long, long time, sometimes millions of years. And they've evolved relatively high civilizations in which a lot of the things that we take for granted, like violence and crime and many other things, just are no longer known. It's very hard for us to believe that civilizations could exist that are very different from ours and inhabited by people that are very different from us. We tend to project a lot. We tend to project some of our own fears. We tend to expect some of our own expectations. And so I would say that this very extraordinary and puzzling phenomenon that takes people by surprise. I had a person who came back from a visitation. She was in tears. Oh, what's the matter? Well, I asked them how many people that the earth could sustain, how many people should live on the earth. And they told me 5 million. Now, she was concerned, of course, about what would happen to the other 99.9%. Not necessarily that 5 million was about the right number of people who live on Earth. Well, what do you think? If there were 5 million people who lived on Earth, we could all live in Tahiti and Malibu and all of the nice places. Wouldn't have to live in Bangladesh and in the Siberian steppes, or in Boston for that matter. And so people come back with their own spin, their own personal reaction to these things. She was absolutely devastated by that information. Other people are devastated by the fact that sperm are taken or ovum are taken. I believe that that does happen. Not as often as people think, but it does. And what is being done with this? Well, Are they making alien hybrids? That doesn't make any sense. The DNA is probably of a completely different sort. It doesn't fit. It doesn't read scientifically. And it doesn't even read logically. That they would use human sperm and ova to do other peculiar things doesn't fit scientifically or logically. They have all of the mechanical devices and psychic devices they need. So you see how much we tend to put our own fears into some of our own reactions. I'll only tell you some of the things that I do think they're up to. If we had the slides there, I would show you slide 12. Is slide 12 available? In the meantime, I'll tell you a little story about some people I met in Alabama, in the Bible Belt. Well, she said, I think they're all demons. She was of the Christian tradition. I said, how is that? Well, they have to be. They're not Christians. Well, I said, they seem to at least claim that they're doing some nice things for people. Well, she says, they're just pretending to be nice until they really show their true colors. I said, well, many of the people who deal with UFOs have turned out to be more spiritual, be more interested in helping the world, helping their fellow man. Oh, she says, they're just pretending to be like that. I said, well, if you read in the Bible, Jesus said, by their fruits ye shall know them. I always like to quote the Bible in the Bible Belt. But here we have a slide that shows a group of people, 105 actually, who were divided by an analysis that I made into 4 groups. On the left side, Group A, people who definitely remembered a UFO experience. B and C are people who had evidence of a UFO experience that they didn't remember. And on the right are people who had no evidence of having had ET contact. But things that distinguish the people who had a conscious memory, and even that held up even in the middle group, is a considerable concern for doing things to help the Earth. They're interested in ecology, interested in world peace, interested in all kinds of what we would think, many of us would think to be good things. Another interesting thing that falls off rather strongly is psychic ability. Very strong on the left, and very little at the right. These people have been inspired in certain ways. So I say, by their fruits ye shall know them. I don't deny that there are certain people out there that are certainly either not concerned, or they're doing strange things, or they're doing things that are interpreted in certain ways. But I'm looking at the total and larger picture. And the picture I get, even beyond this, is that the ETs are really concerned about the future of the human race and the future of civilization here. They may have 2 reasons. One of them sort of selfish. They don't want to see another group of cowboys out in space with interstellar capability out there attacking and perhaps colonizing other naive planets. On the other hand, they may actually be interested in helping us. Well, that's the picture I get. That these people, although sometimes they're misinterpreted and sometimes some of them are not so good, on the whole, are really interested in helping us evolve into a new civilization that can join their ranks. Now, if indeed there are people in our various government agencies who want us, who have a fearful reaction, they have many ways of promoting that idea, and Dr. Boylan has described one of them. I've come across some cases in which some kind of a fake incidents take place, and they're given a very, very bad impression of what ET visitation is like. And I think there is one group that's particularly active in doing this. And I have several people who have had experiences with them. And they seem to have one of their most important factors, one of the most important jobs is to give a bad impression of all of the other ETs. And by promoting this sort of thing, to give a bad impression of the whole idea of ET contact. Well, we may have a choice. We have some people, some extraterrestrial people out there that are really able and I believe willing to help us. But we have a lot of denial to get over. One of the denials is that we can continue forever on a path of doubling our population every 15 in some countries to 80 years in other countries, maybe 30 years on the average. You take a piece of paper, you fold it once, you fold it twice, everything's easy. Fold it 3 times, fold it 4 times. And at some point, any sheet of paper you have, you cannot fold it again. We are at that point in our population on Earth. We're not going to be able to fold the paper one more time. That's a very serious problem. We're seeing parts of it in Somalia right now. This is something that they are concerned about, and we should be also. There are all kinds of areas in which there are dreadful weapons being developed. And we need to take those under control and create a better civilization here on Earth. We need to take crime under control. And they certainly would be people who first to agree to that. One of my conversations with one of the ETs, and I have lots of those just like Giles does, said, do you have any crime in your society? Oh yes, she said, we had a criminal once. 5,000 years ago, we learned about him in school. Giles and other people have reflected on the fact that they don't seem to have emotions. Well, they do. Some of them don't. Many of them do. Some of them have emotions to the point where they get very peeved at me. And some of them show such a fantastic and marvelous love that they can even love me, right? That's like, that seems incredible to some people. So here you have this vast group, very large group of people, most of whom have been around for a long, long time, most of whom have done all of their physical exams long ago. There are a few remnants, like the cattle mutilators, who are trying to learn biology from scratch. They're not willing to listen to the others. They got their own ego. They got to do it themselves. And if you mix in and you realize, as a psychologist here too, how many people have fantasies and how people have fears, how many people have memories of childhood abuse. You know, there's an absolute explanation just right in our home human psyche for many of the things, the bad things that you've heard about. But let's get beyond that. Let's see what we can learn from other civilizations. They have existed for 100,000 or a million years, or even 2,000 or 1,000 or 50,000 years. They have had to learn how to live at some kind of peace with their environment. They've had to learn how to get along with each other so they don't have interminable wars. They've learned a lot of things that we need to learn. We need to pay attention to that. And we're not going to learn anything from people we think of as enemies. Some of them are enemies, right? But the vast majority, in my experience, are really trying to help. And part of the real problem is our denial and our unwillingness to actually listen to information that should be extraordinarily important to us. That's the big problem we have. We don't want to know, for instance, how population has to be limited. We think that we can have all the babies we want, treat them as badly as we want to, have 20 children, you know, some of them dead, and at the same time have all of the freedoms that we want. We have to make some choices, and they're very heavy choices, and we need to think about that. We need to see what kind of information we can get.
Thank you, Dr. Harder.
I guess I'll do this question to Dr. Turner. I'd like you to go a little bit more into the basis for screen memories representing deception.
What is it about that statement you don't understand?
It's not what I don't understand. The basis, well, I guess what I don't understand is what is deceptive about a screen memory?
It's not the truth. We, for instance, have, and you know, and other people have reported on cases where the onset of an encounter, which I choose to call an abduction since it's unwilling, begins with seeing perhaps a 3-foot tall owl in the window. All right, and this is the conscious memory the person has, and there's missing time after that, and then perhaps later under hypnosis or with spontaneous recall, the owl was not an owl. It was an alien. That is deceptive. The owl is a deceptive screen. That's at a simple level what I'm talking about it in one instance. It's not true that there was an owl in the window. I'm really concerned with truth as close as we can determine it to be, and when you have something that distorts or screens the truth of a detail in an experience, then I consider that a deception.
Can I do a follow-up question?
Oh, yes, certainly a counter question is appropriate, of course.
Yeah. Following this a little bit, let me share an experience last night and see how well it fits the definition. When one of the experiences and I were doing a reconnaissance of Area 51, we had occasion to go past the little alien at Rachel. And I thought it was going to be well lit and would be easy to spot in the dark desert, but that did not turn out to be the case. The proprietors had turned off the light, and I was going by at it about, well, let's say, slightly over 55 miles an hour. That may be close to a deception. At any rate, this enormous white rabbit about the size of a German Shepherd hops across the road, and I braked for it, obviously, not wanting to destroy wildlife or my car. As I braked, I noticed this building over there and saw the familiar marquee and said, whoops, that's the Little Alien. The Little Alien Restaurant, a rather famous place where the flyboys from Area 51 go to drink and etc. So this rabbit, I have reason to believe from work with others, peeling back screen memories, may have been something other than a rabbit. My eyes were deceived. It looked like a rabbit. I saw no evidence of it, but frankly, I think they've got an excellent sense of humor, and they did me a favor. Otherwise, I would have shot 5 miles over, been up to Hancock Summit, say, shoot, we missed that. It's getting late. I don't want to turn back. We would have missed Little Alien. So,
well, can I give a more in-depth answer then, for instance, about a different kind of screen memory that may seem deceptive but harmless? In one case, a 10-year-old boy and his 56-year-old grandmother were abducted, and after they were given the green liquid, the grandmother was placed on an inclining table and restrained, and a reptilian was in, there were other kinds there too, but a reptilian alien was involved and approached her and began to try to copulate with her. She fought this very strongly and said no, she had never had sex with anyone but her husband, she never would, and he was dead, had been dead 6 years. The reptilian being backed away from the woman, exited the room momentarily. When he returned, there was her dead husband. And the dead husband was brought up to her to have sex with her. She was then in the altered state that the green liquid seemed to have produced, and she accepted him initially. Before logic fought back through this altered state she was put into, until she could realize it could not be her husband because he had indeed been dead for 6 years. So again, a screen or deceptive device was used to gain what they wanted from her, which was the sex act. And since she was strong enough to fight even under the kind of duress she was put under against the reptilian, they deceived her initially into thinking therefore she was having sex with the husband, because that's who she said the only person she would have sex with would be.
Dr. Fiore.
Well, we can ask questions of the different panel members?
Yes.
Or just
yes.
one question each?
You may ask a question of anyone that you wish, or if you feel that you want to make a
Okay.
comment on the original question, you may.
Okay. I wanted to ask Dr. Turner if any of the people had, whether you construed it as screen memories or not, did they ever report a pleasant experience? Or a good experience, or anything that would be what we could consider uplifting?
Yes, many people have reports of what they consider positive or uplifting, or at least non-intrusive or non-painful experiences. Some of them seem very objective, simply an examination that's not painful, and then they're let go. Others have experiences like one woman who was brought before an auditorium full of aliens and was brought to a podium where a book of some sort was placed on the podium, and she was told to read from this book to the audience, and she looked down at these blue figures that she couldn't read, and then was told if she would put her hand on each figure, she would be able to get a message from it. And as she did this, she got spiritually uplifting or morally uplifting information, which she then proceeded to tell the audience, and she thought that was a very wonderful experience. She was in the presence of a tall humanoid figure with dark black hair with a little widow's peak point. He had on a robe and a crown, and she was very awestruck by the majesty of this man they called the Father. And that was under hypnosis, but under deeper hypnosis, since after this was over, she was in a terrified, crying, panicked, abandoned state. The hypnotist took her right back to before she was returned to her car and said, "What has caused your emotions to be this traumatic?" And she recalled something quite different from this spiritually uplifting event in which she had been suspended naked before this group of beings in a light bar of some sort, and was probed and prodded and used as some sort of biological example, and was praying to Jesus, whom she had great faith in, to make this stop because they were penetrating her. And when she was, "Jesus, make this stop," and of course it didn't stop. So when she was returned to the car, she was having the emotional reaction to her God having abandoned her, to having been raped or having been publicly displayed. And that first memory she had had with the being in the robe and crown and reading the spiritual book really seemed to have been some sort of palliative.
Okay, I would like to ask the question again, but in a different way. Have any of your people reported a positive experience that has not proved to be negative?
Yes.
Okay. I'd like to just comment that in giving this talk to many audiences, people have come up afterward who have said to me, you know, you have emphasized the negative. Of course, I'm a psychologist, so people generally see me for problems. But that I have had experiences with ETs throughout my life, and it's been the most beautiful thing in my life. And I mean, I remember one woman, and she obviously she seemed like an intact person. She was a very creative artist. My next question is for Dr. Harder. You had mentioned...
Edie, we'll come around to you for the next one.
Oh, one question per panel member.
Right.
Oh, that's what I was asking. Okay.
We'll come back around.
Okay.
Okay, Karla?
Yes, and I think I'd like to ask Dr. Boylan, what trustworthy criteria do you use to determine when a person's hypnotist has been leading or has a bias before they go into it, as opposed to one who has an objective, non-leading approach? How do you judge that? Is it by the results of the person's testimony or by some other form?
Well, that would be by the evidence of their style. Best evidence would be transcripts, if available, of the way they ask the question, load the question, shape the question.
Have you got examples?
Plus any pre-talk. The other avenue of distortion can be the mental set of the investigator that the investigator either puts forward to the subject before he or she hypnotizes them, or whose reputation and writings are so well known that the person coming in knows very well the mental set of the investigator, and we know the influence of expectation on people under hypnosis.
Do you exempt yourself from that?
Do I exempt myself from that?
Exempt yourself from having a mindset before you go in, or having a known point of view before you deal with a person?
Well, I've not been very well known, so I don't have the reputation problem. The mindset, I make great pains not to give people, because I'm trying to do solid research and not give anybody an indication of my point of view, that we're just here to find out the facts. And in my experience, the facts tend to speak for themselves when a person gets all of them.